This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 427. My biblical knowledge is a trifle rusty. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
A man of biblical proportions. How are you, sir?
Well, I'm hopefully not that big, but I'm okay. I can't complain.
Good. Well, we are pleased to bring you once again a Morley-Montgomery Award-winning article from the Baker Street Journal. This is part of our series here in season 9 of Trifles. The first episode of every month is dedicated to talking about an award-winning article. The Morley-Montgomery Award, of course, is a cash award given to the author of the best article of the year in the Baker Street Journal. And this one goes back to 1965, volume 15, number 3. Henry Folsom wrote, "My biblical knowledge is a trifle rusty." He examines the nature of Holmes's religious beliefs and uses his own training at the Berkeley Divinity School as he investigates the claims that others put forth for Holmes's relationship to or belief in God. In the end, he allows no one church or religion to claim Holmes as an adherent. And the judges in this case, to determine the worthiness of this article, were William Baring Gould, Basil Davenport, and Rex Stout. So stay tuned for that in just a moment. Meanwhile, we'd like to remind you that we do appreciate your support on Patreon and on Substack. For all of our supporters, we do have bonus content. We just released last month the very first episode of Trifling Trifles, where it's a shorter episode, not worthy of an entire lengthy discussion, but something that we just thought was worth looking into. And in that case, it was about Valentine's Day, entirely appropriate for February. We'll have another Trifling Trifles episode coming up soon, so stay tuned for that and make sure you are signed up to support us on Patreon or Substack. Links are in the show notes. So, Bert, Henry Folsom was a kind of a well-known name around the Baker Street irregulars. Is he somebody that you ever had the chance to interact with?
Oh, I knew Henry quite well and miss him. Henry was one of the founders of the Cornish Horrors in Rhode Island. Henry was one of the leading Sherlockian scholars of his generation, and he was a really interesting guy. I mean, he served as the rector of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in a little town in New Jersey, and then moved on from there. His family had been involved in the Episcopal Church for generations, but he had an unusual path to the ministry. He graduated from Yale, and he became an executive in his family's arms company. They manufactured sporting arms and other things, weapons. to used in sports. So it was the Folsom Arms Company. So they sold firearms and ammunition and things like that. And then he resigned after 4 years to attend a divinity school, which then became Yale Divinity. And he believed at the time, particularly in the post-nuclear age, that the world was heading for disaster and that a return to religion was really the only chance to save the human race. And he was a wonderful, wonderful fellow. The story I like about Henry is that years ago, the Cornishars were going to have an event outdoors. And one of the members of the group asked Henry if he'd put in a good word upstairs for fair weather. And Henry replied right away. He said, "Look, I'm in sales, not management."
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, he gets right into it in My Biblical Knowledge is a Trifle Rusty. He asks us, was Sherlock Holmes an atheist? Certainly not. There were too many references to the deity within the canon for this. Was he an agnostic? Almost certainly not again. For there seemed to be too many expressions of a belief in a supreme being to justify such an idea. So on the contrary, he was probably not an active member of any confessional church or denomination. He seems to have been a religious man. Nevertheless, in Baring Gould's book, Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, he agrees with A. Carson Simpson that during the hiatus in Tibet, Holmes so mastered the teachings and contemplative exercises of Lamanistic Buddhism that he actually became an arhanta, an adept. What are we to believe? Is it really possible to define Holmes's religious beliefs at all? To a limited degree, it is. At least working at it negatively, we can discover several things which he was not a Buddhist, not Roman Catholic, but he was a free thinker, and that would imply atheism. So here he begins to get into some of the other scholars and professors and whatnot that have looked at atheism, agnosticism, etc.
Yeah, well, clearly in Sign of Four, Holmes appears to have an extensive knowledge of Ceylonese Buddhism, but Henry doubts that Holmes was greatly influenced by the study. And to Henry, it's quite of Buddhism, and it's quite interesting for Henry the fact that his cocaine use, Holmes's cocaine use, seems to have disappeared after the hiatus. And we hear that he didn't need it anymore so he could achieve tranquility without using this sort of artificial device. But Watson is not too sure of it. Watson still has a lot of anxiety about a possible relapse. And Holmes, particularly when he's forced to undergo a lot of inactivity, which is like just before the events of the missing 3/4. So, it's so clearly the hiatus has had some sort of major influence on Holmes. And while he was never a complete abstainer from alcohol, there really are only 4 instances, says Henry, of his drinking after the hiatus. And in each case, it was wine, although that's not really literally true, says Henry, because Henry finds 5 references to alcoholic beverages. And then, of course, Henry gets into chronology, and this was one of Henry's innovations. He was one of the early chronologists who, like many of the early chronologists, built his chronology of the cases of Sherlock Holmes with no awareness that anybody else was doing the same thing. And one of the things that really defined Henry was his chronology of the cases of Sherlock Holmes and its update. And then from there, Henry gets into, he asks himself, well, what were Holmes's attitudes towards killing living things? And this, of course, has a lot of resonance, particularly with Henry's own personal experience with the Folsom Arms Company. Henry, I should say, was an avid hunter, and among other things, published a book about his hunting experiences in Africa. At least one book, maybe 2.
He's a regular Leon Sterndale. But this is fascinating because, again, the chronology certainly helps out. The attitude toward killing living things. He said after the hiatus, it seems that Holmes only killed one time. Do you know what he killed or who he killed that one time after the hiatus?
Yes, it's the lion's mane, the Cyanea capillata.
Yeah. Of course, before the hiatus, we have Holmes killing Tonga, a well-aimed shot there on the river chase in the Thames. He drove the snake back into the ventilator that led to Grimsby Roylott's death. And we can see at the end of that him kind of mulling on that philosophically as to whether he was responsible for Roylott's death, directly or indirectly. Of course, he was responsible for Moriarty going over the edge of the falls.
Yeah.
So Holmes did not have his hands were not clean.
Well, Moriarty slipped.
He was pushed.
He was pushed.
But this idea of acquiring this reverence for life, Henry notes, is something that is Oriental. That this broader respect for life, and that's something he brought back with him.
Well, also, Henry points out that speaking about, taking human life, now Holmes did carry a revolver occasionally and threatened to use it, but in 3 Garadebs he comes the closest, but he doesn't. Instead of shooting Killer Evans, he beans him over the head with the butt of the revolver.
Right.
So the conclusion there is Holmes did not resort to violence if it was unnecessary. And the next step then is Holmes allowing his conscience to lead him into technical violations of the law by releasing criminals when there were mitigating circumstances and when their freedom would not jeopardize any innocent people. For example, in the Abbey Grange. So now you can see the outline of this is Henry's doing a character analysis based on Holmes's actions, taking human life, resorting to things to deal with his lethargy, his use of cocaine, being able to find tranquility. So he's building up a little personality profile here.
And as he looks at this violation of the law at the point, he says why this should be any more indicative of Buddhist leaning rather than Christian is not made clear. But again, it's academic. And he notes the times he did it before and lays them out. Final Problem, Boscombe Valley Mystery, Blue Carbuncle, Silver Blaze, Crooked Man, etc. At any rate, if we're objective, he writes, there doesn't seem to be any significant change in Holmes's character in this respect after his visit to Tibet.
No, there really isn't. The whole idea, the argument of Holmes as a Buddhist, I think really doesn't hold up. But Holmes was clearly thoughtful about life and valued it. We hear him say, for example, your life is not your own. Keep your hands off of it. It's a quote from The Veiled Lodger, and it's, kind of irrelevant and not particularly connected to anything that might have happened to him in Tibet. But an unprejudiced reader can lead just as easily to a Christian interpretation of Holmes's beliefs as to a Buddhist one. And in any case, you sort of get to the point where Holmes doesn't appear to have been influenced to any degree by the teachings of anyone he could have encountered during the great hiatus.
Yeah, and again, other quotes that he finds, he says, an unprejudiced reading can lead just as easily to a Christian interpretation as to a Buddhist one. All in all, these arguments should leave us quite unconvinced that Holmes was influenced to any degree by the teachings over a period of some days of the head Lama. But to lay this theory to rest once and for all, let's take one more objective look at Holmes and his habits, which are really so un-Buddhist, as Henry writes. Did he possess the tranquility of soul that the Arhanta is supposed to have had? Hardly. In the three students, he said, my friend's temper had not improved since we had been deprived of the congenial surroundings of Baker Street. Without his scrapbooks, his chemicals, his homely untidiness, he was an uncomfortable man. Well, where's the tranquility of soul that we expect to see if Holmes was a Buddhist?
Well, we can sort of draw a line under the Buddhism thing, and just to restate it, what's happened here is that Bill Baring Gould and Carson Simpson have written the idea that when Holmes came back from Tibet, he was a student and maybe even a master of Buddhist teaching. And so Henry's taken us through an extensive look at Sherlock Holmes' actions and cases and come to the conclusion that there's no case there. And then Henry says, we can now come to a claim made by some students of the canon that Holmes was a devout Roman Catholic. I suppose this is based on three facts. First of all, he did have a probable, but not certain, Roman Catholic ancestor in the person of his grandmother, who was a sister of the French artist Vernet. But Henry says, well, this doesn't really hold up either, because look at me. I've got both French and South of Ireland Roman Catholic ancestry, but I'm not of that communion. Most people can have a trace of post-Reformation Roman Catholicism in their ancestry, but that doesn't necessarily make them members of the Church of Rome. And then the second thing is Henry says, 2 occasions Holmes investigated cases on behalf of the Pope or the Roman hierarchy, the sudden death of Cardinal Tosca, the little affair of the Vatican cameos. But again, what's conclusive about that? Was there anybody else to whom the Pope could turn? After all, Holmes was Europe's leading criminal expert. And look, a cleric of the Church of England did so, consulting Holmes in the Devil's Foot, Vicar Roundhay, and apparently the Egyptian Coptic Church turned to him for help with the case of the 2 Coptic patriarchs. That doesn't make Holmes an Anglican or a Copt. So...
Yeah. And, the fact that the Pope consulted him should not be construed as evidence he was necessarily a Roman Catholic, just as the fact that he had a commission from the Sultan of Turkey does not prove that he was a Mohammedan. And then here's an interesting one. I haven't really thought about this. In a scandal in Bohemia, you could think that Holmes was assisting at a Roman Catholic wedding when he served as the legal witness there for the marriage of Irene Adler and Godfrey Norton. Of course, we know that they went to St. Monica's Church in the Edgware Road. It's a Roman Catholic church. So assume that it was a Roman Catholic church and Holmes was a Roman Catholic. And if both of these assumptions are true, then he was guilty of a gross irregularity, and his action would probably have invalidated the marriage, because he witnessed in disguise and thus under false pretenses. No devout Roman Catholic would ever do this. Now, of course, this objection is equally valid if we claim Holmes was a devout Anglican witnessing a ceremony in the Church of England. But if this was a Roman Catholic church, Holmes almost certainly was not a member of that communion, because he referred to the officiant as a clergyman. Were he Catholic, he would have called him a priest.
Well, also, says Henry, the term the surpliced clergyman, wearing a surplice, almost necessitates an Anglican priest rather than a Roman one. And if the wedding was Anglican, then the whole thing becomes irrelevant in determining whether or not Holmes was a Roman Catholic. So these 3 points, the probability of a Roman Catholic ancestor, the fact that he was employed by the Pope or Roman hierarchy, the possibility that Irene Adler's marriage was within a Roman Catholic church, that's all the evidence you can find about thinking of Holmes as a Roman Catholic. And there's a lot to indicate he wasn't. the fact that he ate meat on Friday and the beryl coronet, the sign of 4, the blue carbuncle, and maybe a scandal in Bohemia. And he probably attended either Oxford or Cambridge, and therefore was probably almost certainly not even a casual member of the Roman Catholic Church. Because in those days, Cardinal Manning, the leader of all English Roman Catholics, would not allow members of his church to go to either Oxford or Cambridge.
Oh, interesting.
And if it is argued, as it certainly can be, that there's no real evidence that Holmes did indeed attend Oxford or Cambridge, maybe someplace else, well, we can still discount this Roman claim on the grounds that in the Gloria Scott, Holmes speaks of having one day gone down to chapel. Well, obviously, this must have been Anglican of the established church. No Roman Catholic would have gone to university services, yet the reference in the Gloria Scott makes it obvious that Holmes did so.
Yeah, another kind of side observation here by Henry Folsom is that in The Crooked Man, Holmes mentioned Mrs. Barclay was a member of, quote, the Roman Catholic Church, and says, well, a member of that church probably wouldn't speak of it that way. They'd simply say the Catholic Church, or more likely would just say she was a Catholic. And he says this argument is it's tenuous, but it's in the same case where we find Holmes having limited familiarity with the Bible. The Anglican King James Version of the Bible, in particular, is what he referred to. King James and the King James Version has the first or second book of Samuel, otherwise called the first or second book of the Kings. The only difference is in one of the versions it omits the word "the" before king. So again, an academic approach here in terms of picking apart some of these observations and terminologies that we see within the story.
Well, and Henry, speaks with some authority here, too, as a clergyman and a graduate of divinity school. And he says, look, a Roman Catholic doesn't speak of 1st or 2nd Samuel at all, but of 1st or 2nd Kings. And that's, so it's virtually certain that were Holmes a Roman Catholic and familiar even remotely with the Bible, he would have said, my biblical knowledge is a trifle rusty, I fear, but you will find the story in the 1st or 2nd of Kings. So his scanty exposure to Scripture, says Henry, must have been through the King James Bible, a version forbidden to Roman Catholics at that time.
Ah, the forbidden knowledge, yes. And he said, look, I've seemed more concerned so far with showing that Holmes, what Holmes was not, rather than being concerned about what he actually was, religiously speaking. And I suppose this is so because positive evidence is so scanty in the canon. What can we deduce about Holmes's beliefs and to what church, if any, he did belong? Regarding that latter question, I believe it's impossible to say with any certainty what church he did belong to. But just by the law of averages, it's likely that he was a nominal member of the established Church of England, the Anglican Communion. But it's apparent that he wasn't an active member or communicant, or he wouldn't have eaten meat on Friday, which is a practice forbidden to Anglicans, just as it is to Roman Catholics. Beyond this, I won't even hazard a guess as to his church membership. He may have been nonconformist or even a nominal member of any church. It is impossible to say.
But Holmes's larger religious beliefs, the way he looked at the universe and so on, are not quite so obscure. He certainly believed in a personal deity. He was no nature worshiper or pantheist. He speaks of a deceased criminal now having to face a higher judge, which implies a belief in moral responsibility. That's very tightly connected to Christian ethics. He felt that men would be held morally responsible for their actions, if not in this world, then in the next. Obviously, Holmes believed in the life hereafter. We find this in The Veiled Lodger and in His Last Bow. The words indicate a genuine faith in divine love and providence when Holmes says, "Good old Watson, you are the fixed wind, the one fixed point in a changing age. There's an east wind coming all the same. Such a wind as never blew on England yet, and it will be cold and bitter, and a good many of us may wither before its blast, but it's God's own wind nonetheless, and a cleaner, better, stronger land will lie in the sunshine when the storm has cleared."
So, religiously speaking, what was Sherlock Holmes? Well, probably born into the Anglican Church in his native land. It's almost certainly a child of that strange, sentimental Victorian age, one which intellectuals very often drifted away from the Orthodox religion, and they settled in some sort of certain reverent agnosticism. And by this term, Henry says, I don't mean doubt about the existence of some sort of supreme being, but doubt as to his nature, his attributes, the life hereafter, etc. But this lack of orthodox belief didn't leave Holmes without compassion, genuine compassion for his fellow man, no matter how he attempted to conceal it under that analytical shell. And he didn't lose faith in the one, capital O, who is ultimately and perfectly good, and whose judgments cannot be clouded by the fallibility and imperfection of human nature.
You know, the interesting thing about Henry's paper, like the strange event of the dog in the nighttime, is what he doesn't include. I just realized this, as we walked through Henry's terrific paper, Morley-Montgomery winning paper. He doesn't refer to that scene about the rose.
Yeah. The goodness and justness of providence.
Yeah. The rose being extra.
Yeah. Well, and that's probably more of a philosophical discussion than a religious discussion, I think. It has a foot over either side of the line there, but from Henry's perspective, I don't know that exchange, that monologue, would have told us anything about Holmes's preferred religion. More about his agnosticism, I would imagine.
Well, that's true, but even from a study in Scarlet on, Holmes is occasionally referring to providence. In Study in Scarlet at some point, we hear about, the hand of providence. Of course, maybe that's really in the mouths of many other people too, but it is in the Naval Treaty where Holmes says, very specifically, there's nothing in which deduction is so necessary as in religion. It can be built up as an exact science by the reasoner. Our highest assurance of the goodness of providence seems to me to rest in the flowers. All other things, our powers, our desires, our food, are all really necessary. But this rose is an extra. It's an embellishment of life, not a condition of it, and it's only goodness which gives extra. And so I say again, we have much to hope from the flowers.
And that is no trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Could I have a serious moment with you, please? No. I just want to ask a question. Do you believe in the hereafter?
Of course I do.
Then you know what I'm here after.